We're in John chapter 11, and we've come to a scene of mourning and grief-stricken family. Lazarus has died, despite the fact that the sisters Mary and Martha were sent to Jesus in order to get him to save him. But unfortunately, Jesus has come too late. I'll read to you John chapter 11, verse 17 to 37. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I now know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he'll rise again in the resurrection of the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world." And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and he's asking for you." And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Well, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" It's a heart-wrenching scene, and it's full of pain and grief, sorrow, and also recrimination is present here as well. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. He was told that Lazarus was sick, and he waited 2 days. After those 2 days, he then journeyed down to Jerusalem. That may have taken 3 days to get there. In total, 5 days since the time, shall we say, when he was first told that Lazarus was sick. And of course, could have been longer than that, simply because to send a messenger would have taken 3 days to get up to the Jordan, as it took 3 days to get back down again. So by the time Jesus got the message, Lazarus had already been ill, and then he waited 2 days, which is 5 days in total, and 3 days back is 8 days. And that, as seen by some, was an unforgivable lapse. A feeling that Jesus did not take seriously his friendship with the one who he said to have loved. So it took maybe up to 8 days from the time when Lazarus was actually ill to the time of Jesus coming. And when he arrived, he'd found that he'd been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. So the news had reached Jerusalem, 2 miles away. Doesn't take very long to get from Bethany from Jerusalem to Bethany, maybe about 45 minutes, thereabouts, along a dusty road. And a number of people had come out from Jerusalem to comfort the two. So there's quite a crowd there. And they'd been there for some days with them, comforting them over the loss of their brother and having put him into the tomb. In those hot countries, of course, you would die, and by sunset you would be in the tomb which was already available and waiting. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Now, there's an interesting difference here between the two, and what are we to make of that difference? There's different ways that you can take that. You can take it that Mary was so disappointed with Jesus that she didn't want to see him, that she was angry with him for not coming to save her brother. She wasn't going to go out and greet him. She was going to show her disapproval by staying at home. And that may well be the implication here, the difference between the two of them. We'd hoped so much of you, Jesus. We'd expected so much of you. Could you not have come and helped the one that you loved? It could be that Martha went out particularly in order to challenge Jesus, on the other hand, and to speak to him and reproach him for his tardiness, his slowness, his lack of desire for coming and saving their brother. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That shows a faith of one kind, but it also shows a reproach as well. There's faith mingled with disappointment in those words here. There's the idea that you could have saved him. I trusted in you because you have the power of healing to save my brother. But you were not here, and so he died. Why did you not come immediately? It's quite likely that if Jesus had even come immediately, he would have not been there in time, having taken, say, 3 days to travel that way. However, but I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Now, what's in those words? What does Mary mean by that? Is she holding out some kind of hope that Jesus can restore something in this terrible tragedy? Is that the idea here? Is this within the back of her mind that she hardly dares to mention what she hopes for? If it is, then it's a faith of a very, very great kind. It's a trust in the character of Jesus which goes way beyond maybe other people. You can do whatever you like, Jesus, and I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. What did she mean by that, whatever you ask? It seems to me it could only really be the idea that you can do something to bring Lazarus back. But I hardly dare to hope it. In fact, it's a hope against hope. It's a fond, desperate clinging to straws that maybe something can be done to bring my brother back. Something can be done. There's tragedy here and a clinging desperation that I want him back. We need him back. How can it be done? You can maybe do something. I don't know. Is it possible? That kind of idea runs through this. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection of the last day. No, in other words, I'm not really expecting you to raise him from the dead here and now. I would hope that such a thing could be possible in the wildest fragments of my imagination. I would cling to any desperate straw of hope, but to be grounded in the truth and the facts, well, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. This is a standard understanding. Everyone believed in the resurrection at the last day. I'll meet my brother again then. I hope against hope, but let me just show that I'm not asking too much of you, Jesus. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Now there's another I am statement by Jesus Christ. I am the resurrection and the life. I guess that I can't imagine anyone ever having said such a thing. Jesus is full of statements which are just utterly unique to any human being. I am the resurrection and the life. I determine who will rise again and who will not. I determine who will live and who will not. I have the power of life and death under my total control. I can raise the dead. That's what's being said here. I'm the resurrection and the life. I am, me, here, in front of you. An impossibility, of course, but it's only impossible if you do not believe that very first verse in John's Gospel. If you believe, as I've said to you before, this is the leitmotif which runs throughout everything that happens in John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Believe that, and everything else follows. Don't believe that, and nothing makes sense. I am the resurrection and the life. Nothing has been made which has been made without the word of God bringing it forth. And God said, and Jesus said, he who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Now here we have a contrast, because I've said throughout that Jesus speaks in metaphors, and that we need to understand things in a metaphoric way. And finally his disciples are getting to the point of view which they begin to understand the way in which Jesus speaks. They begin to understand that he speaks in metaphors. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. Is that metaphoric, Jesus? Do you mean that in a spiritual sense they will forever live in some spiritual way? In heaven? That's how one would understand the metaphoric words here. He who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. What a statement of faith and belief. She believes it. And we believe it too in a metaphoric sense. It's quite easy to believe it in a metaphoric sense. Metaphorically, to believe in Christ, metaphorically, to live and not to be dead, is to have your mind set on spiritual things, and to be forever remembered of others and those who come after us as being the faithful in Christ, and to live in their hearts and minds in that kind of way. That's a metaphoric kind of living. But what we have here is something quite different. For once, the metaphoric is put to one side and collapses down into the reality of real life and real death. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and said, "The teacher is here," she said, "and he's asking for you." The power of the words here, "Where is Mary?" He's asking for you. Where is Mary? Why has she not come out here as well? Why are you on your own? You have proclaimed me the Son of God. You believe that I am the resurrection and the life. What about Mary? And where is she? And why is she not here with you? Why are you not together? When Mary heard that Jesus was asking for her, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. So Martha sent a message of some kind, went back. She went back and called her sister Mary aside. Jesus didn't go into the village. He didn't go into Mary. He called Mary out to him. Maybe a statement of privacy required here, a one-to-one personal word with Mary, rather than all these people who had come from Jerusalem to see. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, and was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. Mary had stayed away from Jesus. Maybe as a form of reproof. Maybe as an idea that I'm too upset that you've let us down, Jesus, and I don't want to see you. But Jesus calls for her, and she comes. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." Interesting, because the words that Martha said to Jesus was, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." The same words. Identically the same sentiment, the same ideas, the same thoughts, the same recriminations, the same painful accusation. And they must have shared that accusation when Lazarus died. They must have said to each other, if Jesus had been here, he would not have died. Where is he? Why has he not come? What's taking so long? Why has he not hurried here? Why has he not come to be with us? If Jesus was here, he would not have died. You can imagine the scene, the deathbed, where his sickness is getting worse and worse and worse. Where is Jesus? Is he coming? Is there any sign of him? He's not come. And he still didn't come after he died. And they buried him. And they put him in the tomb, and still Jesus hadn't come. And the next day, he'd been in the tomb 24 hours, and still Jesus hadn't come. And the next day, and the next day. And on the fourth day that he'd been buried, Jesus turns up. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, as she was at his feet, crying bitter tears of loss, of grief, and recrimination, you could have saved him. Then, and the Jews who came along with her, following behind, also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Now that's an interesting thing. Here's a person, Jesus Christ, the power of the resurrection and the life, who knows exactly what he plans to do. He plans to raise this man from the dead. So why should he bother weeping also? It's his moment of magnificent, miraculous triumph. Why should he be weeping? There is compassion in those tears. It's compassion for those people that he's looking at. Compassion for Mary, compassion for Martha, compassion for the crowds who are in tears and grief-stricken at the painful loss that death brings within its painful wake. And it's not possible to be a feeling and sensitive person and to be immune to that pain and to that grief and to that loss which is around you, and to feel the burden of death itself and the destruction which it brings and the pain and agony which it carries with it, what Paul calls the sting of death. And Jesus is deeply moved in his spirit and troubled by the pain that death itself brings upon everyone and everything. The very nature of death itself being so destructive and agonizing even to those who are left behind. Deeply moved in spirit, troubled. There is affinity, there is feeling, there is empathy, there is the humanity of Christ here, which shares fellow humanity with all those who suffer from death and loss and grief. And Jesus is deeply troubled in the face of death. Maybe also there's an echo of what is about to take place in his own life in a matter of a few weeks. Here he stands on the edge of Jerusalem, where he knows he's going to surrender himself to death shortly. His own life is prefigured here in the death of Lazarus, and the grief and the pain which that will bring to a multitude of people is echoed within himself also. Death is a destroying angel, a powerful force of destruction and pain, leaving heartache and a bleeding heart in its wake. Jesus recovers himself. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus comes. He's confronted by the tomb with a stone in front of it. It's going to be very reminiscent to him of maybe his own tomb. Going to be something which he will experience firsthand himself. How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is. This is an emotion that runs through every single living person, and the crooked timber of humanity is warped and destroyed by this whole nature of death, which brings everyone down to the grave without exception, and including Jesus himself in that, but he gives himself up voluntarily to it and will cause that pain. And Jesus wept. This is the shortest verse in the entire Bible, but it probably carries more impact and emotion than probably any other verse of comparable within John's Gospel. Jesus wept. You have here someone who carries within him the very essence of Godhood, who is in the Father and the Father in him, who in the very beginning was with God and was God, who takes upon himself the humanity and the frailty, the emotion of human beings, to suffer as they suffered, to feel as they feel, to understand as they understand, in a way which would be impossible without the twin natures of the Son of God and the Son of Man joined together in a single human person. And here we see that element of humanity and godhood combined in this outpouring of emotion. Jesus wept in the face of death. Then the Jews said, "See how much he loved him." Yes, indeed. And how loved. I think there's something deeper than just love for Lazarus here, though. There is a weeping over the destructive power of death itself. How it brings everyone down to the grave. There's weeping in that for every person of humanity. There is pain in that for every single living human being. There is loss for everything that the world has been touched with by sin and death and pain and destruction. And it's all there concentrated in this single picture of the tomb where Lazarus has been dead for 4 days behind it. The Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Again, the twin ideas of faith on the one hand, the faith that Jesus can do something, and the recrimination on the other, fused together in these statements, both of Mary and of Martha, and now of the passing Jews. Those people all believing that Jesus could do something, and the recriminations that he didn't, and no understanding of why that should be. But we'll find out why in the very